and it's true. And it's particularly true of this passage this morning. Now, I can't say why. I can offer you some thoughts and some questions, which I think is often the best way to deal with complicated and difficult and challenging Old Testament stories. I'm also going to get quite political this morning, so if you're going to get offended by my politics, Sarah's already rolling her eyes at me, then I'm sorry about that. But there are some things I think we need to think about quite seriously as our world changes. Well, it's always been changing, but the changes are quite obvious at the moment. And I think there are some things that we need to be aware of in the midst of all of that. And I'm probably going to be quite controversial, but nothing new there, hey? So, last time we looked at David, we looked at the bit of his story where Nathan had just come to him after the whole Bathsheba episode, and Josh talked to us about that. We're going to skip a couple of chapters on, because the next two chapters don't apparently directly refer to David, but of course they're part of his story. So the chapters we're skipping over, if you've got your Bibles in front of you, you might want to just have a quick flick, because I'm going to summarize these. Chapters 13 and 14. And this microphone's just descended. Never mind. Chapters 13 and 14. Thank you, Sarah. Be my sound tech. And then we're going to look at chapter 15. All the second bit is like a Dalek. So this is where the Bible should really be X-rated. Chapters 13 and 14, there's some pretty horrible stuff that happens here, which I'm not going to go into immense detail about, but you can read for yourselves if you choose. So one of David's sons, Amnon, fancies his half-sister Tamar, and through a convoluted set of things that he does, he manages to get her to sleep with him. And then he completely humiliates her afterwards. Now remember that back in 2 Samuel 12, Nathan had already said to David, you're going to be, because of what's happened with Bathsheba, you're going to escape, but humiliating things are going to happen to your family. In particular, your wives will be slept with by someone from your household in public view. And this is all leading towards that happening. So Amnon has done this. Absalom, who is Tamar's full brother, is furious and wants revenge, kind of understandably, but doesn't act immediately, partly because David puts the brakes on it. But eventually he manages to set it up for Amnon to be killed, not directly by him, but by a group of people who are loyal to Absalom. Absalom then flees because he thinks David's going to get him for it, understandably again. But David, rather than actually wanting to get revenge on Absalom, mourns for him, but he doesn't do anything about it. He's just miserable. I wonder if any of us have ever been in that place before. I have. So he's miserable about it, does nothing about it, but his most loyal servant, Joab, can see exactly what's going on and basically comes up with a cunning plan, which I won't go into the details of, for Absalom to be brought back to Jerusalem and for it to be okay. But when Absalom is brought back, David doesn't see him for 2 years. And there's this wonderful Monty Python thing that happens. Eric Delve talked about this years ago. It's one of those things that made me think, okay, here's a Christian who's got the same sense of humor as me. Because Absalom gets so fed up with nothing happening, he keeps going to Joab and saying, look, what's going on? In the end, he gets his servants to set fire to Joab's field so he gets his attention. That's really extreme. Right, you haven't paying attention to me? I'll just set fire to your fields. That'll get you to come. And he does. And then things happen. And finally, Absalom is brought before David. But there's still not a complete reconciliation there. There's still a distance in that relationship. And it isn't explained to us why David won't fully talk to Absalom about how he feels. He just doesn't. And as a result, it seems what happens is that Absalom becomes more twisted, more bitter, and does some very peculiar things, and basically decides that his dad is rubbish as a king, and it's about time he took over. And this is where this leads up to. And this is, I just want to read this bit. It's not from this passage above, but it's from the beginning of chapter 15. In the church Bibles, it's on page 225, the bottom of the right-hand column. What Absalom does is this. I'll go from verse 2. He'd get up early and stand by the side of the road leading to the city gate. Whenever anyone came with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, Absalom would call out to him, "What town are you from?" He would answer, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative of the king to hear you." And Absalom would add, "If only I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone who has a complaint or case could come to me, and I would see that he receives justice." Also, whenever anyone approached him to bow down before him, Absalom would reach out his hand, take hold of him, and kiss him. Absalom behaved in this way towards all the Israelites who came to the king, asking for justice, and so he stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Okay, political warning coming up here. He doesn't do anything. He just says he would if he was king. And actually, when he's king, he doesn't. He's rubbish. To be honest, he's really the wrong king. So this is where I think, and it struck me very forcibly when I was reading this passage, partly because I've been listening to something on the radio about how our political climate is changing. And as Christians, no matter where we stand politically, and this is not something I'm asking you to take a particular party political view on, but as Christians, we need to be very careful now about what is happening in justice and injustice at the moment. I'm sure you're well aware that The Guardian has named its word for the year as post-truth. We're living in an age of post-truth where the people who tell lies are the people who win campaigns. And we all know that lies have been told, and we all know that those won the campaigns. That is not a healthy way for a world to be run. It's a way that leads to bigotry, racism, injustice, and all sorts of problems further down the line. Why has it got there? I think it's happened because those of us who thought that everything was getting a little bit better and the world was becoming more tolerant have kind of fallen asleep a little bit and have thought that everyone kind of agreed with us and didn't realize that there are people around the world who are really suffering and are very angry about the suffering that they're going through, and probably quite rightly so. So, for example, in America, what really won the vote for Donald Trump was the Rust Belt, which hasn't really been considered as part of economic policy in the States over the last few, probably decade, possibly longer. And so, if you live in the Rust Belt and you're a miner and you hear that the government's going to close down your mines because you're not really helping the climate, but they've not got a plan for what you're going to do instead, you're angry. And if somebody comes along and says, "Do you know what, we're not going to close down the mines because it's all a Chinese conspiracy anyway," you're quite happy and you're going to vote for them. It's not true. He will have to close down the mines because he's signed up to a climate change agreement that he can't renege on. But he's told it's a lie, and people will vote for that. It's a lot like Absalom here. Stand at the gate, get in the way, say things louder than people who are telling the truth, and you'll get heard. And as Christians, we need to challenge that untruth. We can't just let it go. We can't just go, "Oh, well, never mind," and be tolerant about it. We need to be pretty angry about it, and we need to be making clear that the truth is told. Because ultimately, the people who are suffering now will suffer more. It won't get better for them. And then they'll become more angry, and it'll get worse. So it struck me that the people who've been telling the lies are like Absalom at the gate, getting in the way, not allowing people to see. I mean, what a ridiculous thing to say that we're going to stop listening to experts. It's actually now almost an insult to refer to an expert. And that all came out of the Brexit campaign. Let's stop listening to experts. What? They're experts. Why would you not listen to them? And but that's now the way it is. And it's acceptable to say that. In fact, it's unacceptable to say what I've just said. Don't listen to the experts because they're arrogant. We should be, and we need to be careful, and we need to be challenging these things when we hear them. Let's not let Absalom get in the way, because it causes all sorts of problems. Okay, political bit over. Just thought I'd say that. So, back into this story. Actually, I think this would be a good moment for Io to come up and read this bit of the passage to us. So we're going to go from verses 13, it says 27, sorry, that's my mistake, it should be 37. Are you just going to go to 27?
It's all right, I did 10 extra verses. Well done. It's just like being at school, surprise test. Okay, so in the church Bible, it's on page 226. Did you say that already? Verse 13, David flees. A messenger came and told David, "The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom." Then David said to all his officials who were with him in Jerusalem, "Come, We must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin upon us and put the city to the sword." The king's officials answered him, "Your servants are ready to do whatever our lord the king chooses." The king set out with his entire household following him, but he left 10 concubines to take care of the palace. So the king set out with all the people following him, and they halted at a place some distance away. All his men marched past him, along with all the Kerethites and Pelethites, and all the 600 Gittites who had accompanied him from Gath marched before the king. The king said to Ittai the Gittite, "Why should you come along with us? Go back and stay with King Absalom. You are a foreigner, an exile from your homeland. You came only yesterday, and today shall I make you wander about with us, when I do not know where I am going? Go back and take your countrymen. May kindness and faithfulness be with you." But Ittai replied to the king, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king may be, whether it means life or death, there will your servant be." David said to Ittai, "Go ahead, march on." So Ittai the Gittite marched on with all his men and the families that were with him. The whole countryside wept aloud as all the people passed by. The king also crossed the Kidron Valley, and all the people moved on towards the desert. Zadok was there too, and all the Levites who were with him were carrying the ark of the covenant of God. They set down the ark of God, and Abiathar offered sacrifices until all the people had finished leaving the city. Then the king said to Zadok, "Take the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it and his dwelling place again. But if he says, 'I am not pleased with you,' then I am ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him." The king also said to Zadok the priest, "Aren't you a seer? Go back to the city in peace with your son Ahimaaz and Jonathan, son of Abiathar. You and Abiathar take your 2 sons with you. I will wait at the fords in the desert until word comes from you to inform me." So Zadok and Abiathar took the ark of God back to Jerusalem and stayed there. But David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered, and he was barefoot. All the people with him covered their heads too, and were weeping as they went up. Now David had been told, "Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom." So David prayed, "O Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness." When David arrived at the summit, where people used to worship God, Hushai the Archite was there to meet him, his robe torn and dust on his head. David said to him, "If you go with me, you will be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, 'I will be your servant,' O king, I was your father's servant in the past, but now I will be your servant. Then you can help me by frustrating Ahithophel's advice. Wouldn't the priests Zadok and Abiathar be there with you? Tell them anything you hear in the king's palace. Their 2 sons, Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, and Jonathan, son of Abiathar, are there with them. Send them to me with anything you hear." So David's friend Hushai arrived at Jerusalem as Absalom was entering the city.
Well done, Aya. Great. That's a great tongue twister, isn't it? Ittai the Gittite. Use that for a drama warm-up, I think, later. Okay, so I'm going to offer you some episodes that are in this passage and some thoughts around this. So I said this thing earlier about David's family being under a curse, but he is under a blessing. So where's the justification for that? If you go back to 2 Samuel 7, verses 14 to 16, both these things come from Nathan, the prophet. And Nathan says to him in verse 14 to 16 of 2 Samuel 7, which is on page 220, "I will be," talking about God and David, "I will be his father and he shall be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with the rod of men, with floggings inflicted by men. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom shall endure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. So there's clearly, although David is going to be punished when he does things wrong, it's going to be out of love, and it's because God will never take away from him the blessing that he has been given. So that's an amazing promise. By the way, that's your promise. Not so much about the punishment, more about the love that will never be taken away from you. It cannot be. You have that reassurance, and that should never be something that you need to question. But then in chapter 12, verse 10, after the whole episode with Bathsheba, is it verse 10? Yes, it is. He says on page 223, now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. This is what the Lord says, out of your own household I am going to bring calamity upon you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will lie with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel. So David's, we know from his Psalms, he is very good at remembering at what God has said to him. And I think he had both these things very strongly in his mind. And when he flees, he's fleeing because he knows he's in trouble. And he, I'm sure, remembers this whole verse about the sword. The sword is going to come upon him. And he thinks, okay, this is now it. And he's kind of right. So in that sense, he gets it right. But the thing that I question here, and this is why I've put flawed David up, is he leaves behind these concubines to take care of his palace. He knows what's going to happen because he's already been told. And sure enough, not in this chapter, but a little further down the line, basically Absalom sleeps with all of them in public. He puts a tent on the roof of the palace and everybody's out there watching. And of course, you can imagine what an appalling act that is. Rape is still used as a weapon of war, and it was used then. And Absalom does that because he's advised to by his advisor. He basically says to him, look, if you do this, everybody will know you're more powerful than David. You'll show who you really are. But I'm sure David knew that was going to happen. He knew at the very least these women were vulnerable. And it also says, even though they're called concubines here, that God treats them as David's wives. He has the same attitude towards them as he does to David's wives. So, massive question. Why did David do that? Did he do it because he knew it was going to happen? Is it like a fatalistic thing that if this is what God has said, okay, I'll make it easy for you, God. I'll leave the ones that I care about a bit less behind, and you can do with them as you choose. If that's true, that's appalling. But it may be. It may be what he thought, because he takes good care of his other wives. I don't know. I'm offering you questions here. What I do know, though, is that we don't live in Old Testament times, we live in New Testament times. And some of us, including myself at times, take upon ourselves things that we have been told about ourselves. They may not have been given to us as a prophecy. They may have been things that have been told to you that are negative things you're no good at, things that are going to happen to you in your life. And we can set it up so those things happen. They become what is called self-fulfilling prophecies. Something you've been told that is negative about who you are, and you think, okay, well, that's what I am then, and you live like that. You don't have to. I mean, I don't quite understand, to be honest, how God works with time. I don't know whether Nathan said that to David because God knew that was what was going to happen, and it was just going to happen. But we have free will, and David had free will. And we also have a clear conscience, and we also have commandments. We also have the grace of the Spirit with us. We know what is right, we know what is wrong. I can't believe that David thought that was the right thing to do. But he thought it had to happen. It didn't, I don't think. Not in the way that he made it happen. What is he fleeing from? Is he fleeing from a prophecy that he believes has to come true and therefore he's just got to go along with the ride? Or is he fleeing from himself? Fleeing from what he's done? Because all that has happened with Amnon, Tamar, and Absalom in many ways were seeds that he had sown. Why did Amnon think it was okay? What did his dad do before? There's got to be a link, even though the text doesn't give us that commentary. And David knew that in many ways the knot that was there was his own fault. And he's in many ways right to flee because he's in trouble if he doesn't. But he can see what's caused it. So that's my thought on the first episode in this chapter. Moving on, there's then a very positive thing that happens with our tongue twister guy who comes along, Ittai the Gittite. So he's only actually been with David for a very short time. I think it says here he's only been with him for a day. And why has he come? Because, where is it? Yeah, you came only yesterday, he says in verse 20. So why are you coming with me now? Go home. Because Ittai the Gittite, the Gaths, are Philistines. They're the enemies of Israel. So what on earth are they doing in Jerusalem? Well, if you go back in David's story, you may remember that when he was exiled from Saul, he spent time with Gath, with that part of the country, and he fought for them and worked alongside them. And he was a very powerful warrior with them and brought many people to them. Now, I don't want to go into the whole thing about fighting with people and all the rest of it, but what is important here is that David had been honorable, he'd been just, and as a result of that, he has loyalty given to him by this guy who should be his enemy. So my next thought about this episode is, are we creating enemies or are we creating friends? As Christians, our call is to share God's grace with the people that we meet on a daily basis. Do we do that in a way that creates friendship or enemies? And I'm not saying that because then when you're in trouble you'll get friends, but that probably will happen, as this passage illustrates, but more because that's what we're called to do. And that in itself can bring peace. If Ittai the Gittite had gone back to Philistine because of all that had been going on, who knows what might have happened? They might have thought, okay, the kingdom's weak now, let's invade. But by actually keep staying with David, there's actually a very positive thing ultimately that comes out of that. But I want you to also think about this verse that is here, or the actual words are used, because the words aren't really captured for us. When David says, may kindness and faithfulness go with you, in verse 20, really our translation can't capture all that the Hebrew actually suggests. It isn't just kindness and faithfulness. The word that is used here in Hebrew is chesed, which I probably said wrong, but that's how you spell it, which includes loving kindness, steadfast love, grace, mercy, faithfulness, goodness, and devotion. David is blessing Ittai with all of those things. That's not a light blessing. This guy is clearly a very good friend to him. And that's happened because David has understood about what friendship looks like. And as a result, he's got this return, in a sense, this present at a time when he needs it, because having him around will make a big difference further down the line. Okay, and then the next thing that happens is we meet Zadok, the priest. Listen to the piece of music, Google it this afternoon, it's amazing. But we have Zadok the priest, and he's there with the Ark of the Covenant, which is why I've put that up there for you as an illustration. So remember, the Ark is what contains the commandments, and it's what's basically, for the Israelites, a sign of God's presence. And so when Zadok has that there with him, meeting David, he's basically saying, God is going with you, not with Absalom. And David says this in verse 25, take the ark of God back to the city. That's incredible. Because he's basically saying, I know God is with me. I know what I've done, but the city needs it more than me. That's what makes David a great king. That his concern is not for himself at this point. His concern is for his people and for making sure that God's blessing stays with them, even though things aren't going to go well. Then he says, if I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back again and let me see it and his dwelling place again. But if he says, I am not pleased with you, then I'm ready. Let him do with me whatever seems good to him. Again, I think I need to say a little bit about the words that are used here. Favor actually is better translated as grace. So if I find grace in the Lord's eyes, if he forgives me. So even though David has been told that God's presence will never leave him, he's still not saying that he expects it despite all that has happened. And then when it says, I love this bit actually, when he says, but if he says, I'm not pleased with you, even though that's a negative form, again, the word that is used in Hebrew is chafetz, which means delights. And I love that word, because pleased is kind of a little bit neutral, doesn't have real affection in it. But if you think about the word delight, you can't help but think of a parent delighting in their child. And that's what David wants again. He wants that father-son relationship that he's had with God. Apply this to yourself. David isn't sure that he's still got God's grace. Once again, I want to reiterate to you what I said earlier. There is nothing you can do that will take God's love away from you. There is absolutely nothing you can do. Equally, neither can you do anything more to earn it any better. It doesn't matter how many times you come to the stable, how many times you come to the prayer meeting, even though Morella would love you to come. That's not why you're coming, because you're earning points in heaven. It's because it's great to pray. There is absolutely nothing you can do to get more of God's grace, because it's limitless already. How could you get more of something that is limitless? But neither can you lose it. All that can happen is that you choose not to accept it. Now, David here, understandably, is going, I've been so bad, I don't know if I deserve this anymore. I need God to show me. And that's an understandable thing to say. And if you feel you're in that place, there's nothing wrong with saying to God, I don't know if I've got your grace anymore. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, because he will show you. I guarantee it. But you can't lose it. So where David is unsure at this point, you don't need to be. But it's not a bad thing to have said. He's kind of saying sorry, which is good. And he then carries on, bit there. He needs prophets around him. We all need prophets around them. So thank you, Jenny, for this morning, for prophesying over us. We always need to have prophets amongst us to encourage us. Listen to the prophets we have amongst us too, as David does here. The next thing he does, though, is he goes up the Mount of Olives. Does that ring any bells? What bells does it ring for you? Who went up the Mount of Olives and when? Jesus, always the answer in church. And when did he go? You can't say that answer to the next question, though. When did he go up? It doesn't work, Sarah, does it? Do you remember when he went up the Mount of Olives to pray? Gethsemane is another word for the place he went. The night before the crucifixion. David goes up the same mountain, which is on the edge of Jerusalem, and overlooks it. So you can see why he does. And he's mourning. He's covered his head, and he's got bare feet. And that's a sign of repentance and of mourning, and the people around him are doing the same. And he prays as he goes up about a very specific thing, that this advisor's advice will be confounded for Absalom, so that things can turn around. I don't know if he fully believes that it will happen, but when he gets to the top, he finds someone there, Hushai, who is the person he can send back to confound the advice that would be given by Abiathar. So that prayer is answered. But there's a part of me that wishes that David had spent a little bit longer on the top of the mountain in mourning and repentance. And this is where I think David goes wrong sometimes, and I think we've seen it in the beginning of this chapter too. I get it because I do exactly the same. He kind of gets the word from God. He knows what's going on. He understands what God is saying. And then he says, okay, God, right, you've told me. Off I go. I'm going to do this. So I'll leave the concubines behind, and then you can sort that bit out. And he creates solutions for God that God doesn't necessarily mean or need. And I can do that very easily. And I think a lot of us can. Particularly blokes, perhaps, because we're often problem solvers. I'm not saying that in a sexist way, but women are often better at listening and allowing things to sit. Men aren't. Men are doers. Men need to get things done. Some women are the same, some women are not. Some men are not. You know what I mean. Got myself into a massive sexist pit, and I'm not going to dig myself out of it. So there you go. But I'm still ruled by that terrible book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, which I now have, well, I haven't burnt, but I should, because it's actually mostly rubbish. But that was a bit personal, wasn't it? I need counselling. But my point is this. Often what we need to do, what we're called to do, is to contemplate, not to try and solve the problems, to spend some time with God, just listening. I've told you before, one of my favourite quotes from Mother Teresa and I'll remind you of it if you don't remember it or not heard it before. When a journalist asked her what God says to her when she prays, what she says to God when she prays, she says, "Not much, I just listen." And then the journalist said to her, "So what does God say?" Which is an understandable question. She said, "Not much, he just listens." Now, that's for me an incredible truth that I'm not very good at hearing. But yesterday I went down to Zambian church, which was lovely, where Sonia goes once a month. It was lovely to be there. And the best thing about it, and I think most people who were there kind of felt a bit sorry for me in entirely the wrong way, because all the singing was in their first languages, and there were at least 2 different ones, weren't there? And of course I didn't understand any of it, but that was absolutely brilliant. It was amazing, because what it allowed me to do was sit and contemplate. And it was a Catholic church, so there was loads of iconography around me, and those of you who know me know I love iconography, so I was spending a long time just looking at that and just thinking about what it represented and listening to the spirit of what was being sung rather than the words that were being sung. And I'm a words person, so if you put words in front of me, I'll focus on those first. And for me, that was an incredibly healing time, at a time when I really needed it. And I was just able to sit and contemplate in a very deep way. Now, I want to encourage you to do that, and I've been reading this book gradually over the last couple of weeks by a chap called Richard Rohr, which has just come out, The Divine Dance, which is basically about the Trinity. But don't be put off by that. As soon as you hear somebody say it's about the Trinity, right, I won't read that then. It's a really good explanation in a non-kind of intellectual way. And this particular bit, which is quite near the end of the book, has just leapt out at me. And this is what I think David would have been better doing for a part of this story, perhaps even before he fled. And he's talked about the Trinity, and he's talked about God's power and how it's evidenced among us. And there's this little section called Essential Ecstasy. He loves alliteration. All you have to do today is walk outside and gaze at one leaf, long and lovingly, until you really know, that this leaf is a participation in the eternal being of God. It's enough to create ecstasy. It's not the inherent dignity of the object that matters. So he's not saying the leaf is God. Be clear on that. It is the dignity of your relationship to the object that matters, that transforms object to subject, changes the orientation. And what he's basically saying is, all you need to do is focus on one small thing to see the evidence of God's work in this world. And nature is a very good place to start. We spend so much of our time trying to be other than what we already are and forgetting who we are. And we forget who God has created us to be. Now, as you know, many of you, we've just got a dog. And this bit then leapt out at me. He says, we've been robbed. All creatures naturally allow and inherently communicate this ecstasy, except for the human species. We discriminate, decide, qualify, and dissociate almost all whom we look at, instead of loving them as there are. We're the only ones who deprive ourselves of essential ecstasy. If you doubt this, just watch your dog. Dogs don't stop the ecstasy. Seeing Fudge, our dog, greet Harry this morning, you got that. You might get tired of them jumping up and licking you, but they don't. It's pure, unadulterated, fascinated enjoyment being a dog, apparently. And then most of them just lie down one day and die. No drama. The dog doesn't question reality. It doesn't anguish in existential malaise, beating its paws in the dirt and asking, "Why aren't I a duck?" Apparently, dogs just like being dogs. Mulberry trees like being mulberry trees, and bees like doing what bees do. The red snapper doesn't mind if we've called her a red snapper, although she surely knows her real name. All things give glory to God just by being what they are. There's only one species that resists being what it is, and that's us. So ironically, we're resisting our own happiness. And I think that's incredibly powerful. Yeah. Need to read this book, by the way. I'll lend it around when I've finished it. How does that apply to this passage? David doesn't allow himself to be what he really is. There are flashes of it, moments of it. You can see it in the morning and the repentance as he climbs the Mount of Olives. That's the moment of contemplation. I've stuffed up. I'm in an appalling place. I want to get back into a relationship with God, and I don't really care what else is going on around me. But even in the midst of that, he prays. Was his prayer a good prayer? Well, it produces a result. Possibly so. Possibly God spoke to him as he went up the mountain. Frustratingly, because it's the Old Testament, it doesn't tell us that. It'd be nice for theology if it did, but it doesn't. So, but he's in that moment of contemplation. When he's not contemplating God, when he's not remembering who he's been created to be and enjoying that, that's when things go wrong. That must have been what went wrong with Bathsheba, and it's what's sown the things that have happened since. And then he tries to fix it more because he forgets who God has created him to be. So I suppose my biggest plea to you, I have no idea what the next slide is, by the way. There you go. David with God's plan. Do you know what? I don't like that slide anymore. So I'm going to challenge that slide. That was me thinking he needed a plan. I don't think he did. I think he just needed to be with God. And I think God would do what God was going to do. And it would probably have worked out a little better. God still worked through him, but it wouldn't have been such a mess. So my call to you this morning is try not to be irritated by not being what you're not. Try to enjoy who you are. Remember who God has created you to be. He has spoken to you, all of you. Even if it's not obviously, deep down in your spirit, he's spoken to you, and you know what you are because you know what you enjoy. You know those moments of ecstasy. And if you can't find them, go and find a leaf this afternoon and spend some time with it. Seriously. Meaningful time. And rediscover what it is that God has done for you and what he wants you to be. And just be, don't do.